Tricia Gleason, Assistant City Clerk, you are hereby directed to call a special session of the City Council on Monday, June 15th, 2026 at 5:30 p.m. in the Historic Federal Building for the purpose of conducting a work session on Sustainable Dubuque. So I'll just leave it with that.
Good evening and welcome to a special session of the Dubuque City Council for June 15th, 2026. As a reminder to our viewers and listeners, due to the nature of tonight's meeting topic, public input is not accepted. However, you may contact the City Council directly from the city's webpage at www.cityofdubuque.org/council-contacts and through the City Clerk's office email at ctyclerk@cityofdubuque.org. Attendance at tonight's session is as follows. Mayor Kavanaugh.
Here.
Council members Leindecker.
Here.
Resnick.
Here.
Roussel.
Here.
Sprank.
Here.
Staver.
Here.
Wethel. Assistant City Manager Burbach.
Here.
City Attorney Brumwell.
Here.
Our work session topic tonight is Sustainable Dubuque Greenhouse Gas Inventory Update. I'll turn it over to Sustainability Community Coordinator Gina Bell for the presentation.
Good evening. Gina Bell, Director of Sustainability. I'm here with my colleague Michelle Kim, who's really going to lead us off, but I'm just excited that you're all here to talk about everyone's favorite topic, greenhouse gas emissions. And we also have on the line virtually our consultants from Lotus Engineering.
Good evening, City Council. I'm excited to be here. My name is Michelle Kim, and I serve as the city's Climate Action Coordinator. Tonight, I'm pleased to introduce Rachel Meyer from Lotus Engineering, who led Dubuque's 2025 community-wide greenhouse gas inventory. So every 3 years, we conduct this inventory to measure our community's progress towards our adopted goal of reducing greenhouse gas emissions 50% by 2030 compared to our 2003 levels. Rachel will share the inventory results, what they tell us about emissions across our community, and the progress that we've made together. So with 2030 quickly approaching, we'll soon be bringing forward recommendations for a longer-term science-based emissions reduction target for Council's consideration. And so during your upcoming goal-setting discussions, I encourage you to think about what kind of sustainable, resilient, and thriving community we want to build. With that, I'll turn it over to Rachel. Thank you.
We are the consultants that helped put together the 2025 Dubuque Greenhouse Gas Emissions Inventory. We also helped put together the 2022 Greenhouse Gas Emissions Inventory. And so we're here today to tell you about the results from 2025 and the trends that we've seen between the past couple of years. Not sure if we have the presentation. There we go. Presentation up on the screen. Great. So I'm joined today by my colleague, Emma. She's on the line as well. And I will keep us going here. So if we want to advance to the next slide. Thank you. All right. I just want to make sure that we all start off on the same foot when we're talking about emissions, greenhouse gas emissions, climate change, things like that. So the greenhouse effect has always been happening on Earth. Earth has always had a concentration of greenhouse gases, those being carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxide, ozone, other greenhouse gases. They've always existed since Earth became a planet. Ever since the Industrial Revolution, though, we have been experiencing more and more human-caused greenhouse gas emissions into the atmosphere through things like burning fossil fuels, decomposition of waste and wastewater, and other activities that are human-caused instead of naturally caused. So because we keep adding these greenhouse gases to the atmosphere, naturally greenhouse gases act kind of like a blanket to trap in some of the sun's heat to keep the planet habitable. And so if we're adding more and more of these emissions to the atmosphere, what we're doing is sort of adding more and more blankets to the planet, which is causing it to warm. And the systems are starting to go a little bit out of whack as they absorb all of this additional heat that we are trapping. And what happens then when we throw these systems out of whack a little bit, we get more extreme heat, we get extreme storms like derechos and tornadoes. Sometimes we get other natural disasters that pop up, and these can increase in frequency and in severity over time. And if we continue to emit emissions the way we have, these can continue to worsen and worsen over time. But we know that we can mitigate the worst of these impacts by addressing our human-caused greenhouse gas emissions and reducing those over time. And the way we can do that is by calculating how many emissions are happening on a given year in a given community. So if we want to go to the next slide, what is a greenhouse gas emissions inventory? So what we're doing is trying to account for all emissions that are generated in a community in a given year. So on the screen, you'll see this image that is going to help us sort of understand where emissions are coming from. So the outer box, there's sort of a really thin outer green box on the screen. That compromises our whole boundary for the inventory. So we're looking at a community-wide inventory here, which means we're looking at the Dubuque City boundary. So within the boundary, we can take a look at the different emission sources that occur within the boundary. Those being, the energy used to heat our homes and businesses, electricity, the cars we drive, and any transit or other forms of transportation in our boundary. It's the waste that we produce, both landfilled and human waste, and a bunch of things like that. So what we can do is take account for those in a given year, and then we organize them in a way that helps us understand what our community has control over, or what's really occurring fully within the boundary, and what might be kind of occurring or starting in the boundary, but not emitting until it's outside the boundary. So for instance, if we pretend in Dubuque we didn't have the landfill in the boundary, but if there was a landfill outside of the city in the county, the waste for that, we organize things in scopes. So scope 1 is anything fully occurring within the boundary, and the emissions and activity both occurring within the boundary. Scope 2 is electricity. That one's got a bit of a special way that we have to look at it. So that one gets its own, it's scope 2. And scope 3 is anything where the activity might occur within the boundary. So if we generate human and landfill waste, but it gets treated or disposed of outside the boundary of our community, that is counted as scope 3. Therefore, we don't have full control over how the emissions happen, but we might have control over the activity that's happening within the boundary. So we can organize our emissions by scopes, but really what we're doing is looking at a city's activities and saying how much waste is being produced, or how many miles are our vehicles going, or how much energy is being used to heat our homes, things like that. We add that all up over the course of a year, and then we have our emissions total. So we can head to the next slide. Our emission sources for 2025 are the same as the ones we had in 2022, and they're just a few more that we have in 2022 and 2025 than we did from 2018 back to 2003. So we'll note those later on in the presentation when we get to some of those comparisons, but we just want to highlight here, we have the same sources in 2022 and 2025. The only difference we had this year, Alliant Energy gave us renewable energy generation within the community. They gave us our solar rooftop energy generation. So we were able to include that data in this iteration of the inventory. You can head to the next slide. And some methodology comparisons. So for the most part, everything remained the same between 2022 and 2025. We just had a few things that updated in between those years that we had to account for. So the first being the way that we get to emissions, we use first activity data. So that is something like the kilowatt hours of electricity consumed in our home, or the miles traveled by our cars. And then we use what's called an emission factor to turn that activity into emissions. So that would be, grams of carbon dioxide per vehicle mile traveled, things like that. And we can estimate that for carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxide, 3 of the main greenhouse gases, based on the activity data. The way that we turn the different greenhouse gases into a common unit, we use something called a global warming potential. So that compares the different greenhouse gases to 1 unit of carbon dioxide. So that way everything in the end is in the unit of carbon dioxide equivalent. In between 2022 and 2025, we get these global warming potentials from the International Panel on Climate Change. They release their assessment reports every 7 to 10 years. They released an update to the 6th assessment report, which is the most recent one. And they actually updated the global warming potential for methane because that is a really prominent greenhouse gas. And they split it into 2 separate global warming potentials, one for fossil fuel-based methane emissions, the other for what they call fugitive, which is like methane just from a landfill or methane from a lagoon, more like natural-based methane. So we tried to account for that, those 2 different sources within the inventory. Another note, the vehicle miles travel data that we got for 2022 came from Google. Google has a source called the Environmental Insights Explorer. What they do is they create a model based on your GPS and your Google Maps data, and they're able to tell your starting point, your end point, and the distance traveled for your trips. They were undergoing a massive methodology update in both 2025 and this year, 2026. So 2025 and 2026 vehicle miles traveled data is unavailable. The next iteration of data available will be coming in 2027. So we instead had to use the state's Department of Transportation vehicle miles traveled data, but that was available, so we were able to use that. We made a couple other changes, nothing as significant as the first 2, but the others I'll note. Alliant provided us, as I mentioned, the renewable energy generation data, as well as their own grid-specific transmission and distribution loss rate. So we were able to incorporate that in there. We split out plug-in hybrid electric vehicles and full battery electric vehicles in this inventory. So we were able to account for the electricity and for plug-in hybrids, the gasoline used in those vehicles. And that is it for the most part. So I think we can advance to the next slide. And I'm going to pass it over to my colleague Emma to take us through our results.
Awesome. Thanks, Rachel. So now we'll dive into Dubuque's total emissions. So I can wait for the presentation to, is the presentation still up? Oh, there we go. So Dubuque's total emissions in 2025 were 680,236 metric tons. So you can see that scope 1 made up the majority of the emissions at 69%, and that includes residential and commercial energy use, in-boundary transportation, and in-boundary waste. Scope 2 made up 29%, which is the electricity emissions, and Scope 3 made up the remaining 2% with the transboundary aviation and transmission and distribution emissions. And now looking at 2025 emissions by sector. So commercial and industrial buildings made up the largest chunk at 44%. And this includes all energy, electricity, fugitive emissions, and transmission and distribution used by commercial and industrial buildings. Transportation was next at 29%, and that includes all on-road activity, public transit, railways, and port activity. Residential buildings at 22%, so those are all the same sources as commercial and industrial buildings, just on the residential side. And then that remaining 5% were from waste and wastewater and industrial processes and product use. So that's your solid waste, your compost, your wastewater, and refrigerant leakage. Now diving into some comparisons. So looking at 2018 versus 2025. This slide gives us more of a high-level picture of what emission reduction has looked like between the 2 years, since there are emissions now that we're measuring that weren't being measured in 2018. So overall emissions decreased by 17%, and this was largely due to a decrease in Alliance emission factor, which is why we see a decrease in residential and commercial and industrial emissions. We can also attribute some of that decrease to the implementation of gas collection at the landfill and processing of gas from wastewater treatment plant before the explosion. And then comparing it to 2022. So these have the same sources. We saw a 9% decrease between the 2 years, and many of the source breakdowns, as you can see, stayed the same. In this slide, we just wanted to note that waste and wastewater increased slightly from 2022 to 2025, just because there's a small increase in waste tonnage and the wastewater treatment plant having to flare all methane in 2025. So now we've broken down the 2025 emissions by source to show more of a comprehensive picture of what is producing more emissions in the city. So the largest source we have here is natural gas at 34%, and electricity and on-road fossil fuels both at 29%. Solid waste is 3%, and then all other emissions make up that remaining 5%. And then in this slide, we wanted to point out the aviation emissions, just because this inventory included the commercial flight that was added to the Dubuque airport. Now with that flight going away, we would expect to see aviation emissions drop slightly for the next inventory, but also noting that the aviation emissions didn't even make up 0.25%. So the commercial flight realistically didn't have that large of an impact on this inventory compared to other sources. So in the future, if that commercial flight does come back to Dubuque, it really shouldn't be a concern in terms of overall community emissions reduction. Okay, now that we have an idea of kind of what Dubuque's most current year of emissions looks like, we wanted to show how the city compares to other cities around the Midwest as well as Montana. So all of the cities we found inventories for are similar in size to Dubuque, but not all of them have the same kinds of industry, which does impact emissions. So right now, Dubuque's current emissions per capita are around 11.5, so positions it relatively in the middle of all these other cities listed. In the last inventory, there were more cities in Iowa that we could compare to, but those inventories haven't been updated. So we looked at other nearby cities, and it really didn't seem fair at this point to compare those inventories in Iowa that were done in 2018 or 2019 to the one completed in 2025. So, like I mentioned, Dubuque actually does have a lot of infrastructure that contributes to emissions. Lots of these other places have some type of infrastructure. So, airports, universities, commercial industries, marinas. You can see here, Lakeville has a very low emissions per capita, and they don't actually have any infrastructure. But overall, Dubuque happens to have most, if not all, types of infrastructure within the city. So this does play a role in emissions, but also important to remember that it's vital to the city and the economy. And with Dubuque having control and owning a lot of that infrastructure, it does mean that a city has opportunities to really champion in investing in climate-friendly infrastructure in the future. Now looking at emissions over time, and this is specifically looking at comparable sources. So comparable sources are those emissions that we've seen from 2003 to now. In this case, we're just looking at 2018, 2022, and 2025. So this chart does not include the list of sources Rachel shared at the beginning that started in 2022. So between 2018 and 2025, all sources decreased except for on-road gasoline and diesel vehicle emissions. Between 2022 and 2025, all sources decreased except for commercial and industrial natural gas, on-road diesel, and landfill emissions. And then between 2022 and 2025, Alliance emission factor decreased 15% due to a continued expansion of their renewable energy portfolio. And that did contribute to a large portion of that decrease we've seen in electricity emissions. And since 2018, that emission factor has actually decreased a total of 40%. So as Rachel talked about in the beginning of the presentation, an emission factor is that value that represents a quantity of greenhouse gases that are released into the atmosphere by a specific activity. So in Alliance case, that activity data would correspond to a kilowatt hour, we'll say, in a residential building. So you can multiply that by the emission factor to get overall emissions. So now, even if we see that activity data increase a little year over year, and Alliant continues to work to decrease their emission factor by using more renewable energy in their utility mix, we'll still see emissions decrease. And then the last thing I wanted to call out in this slide is the trend that we see for on-road gasoline vehicles between 22 and 2025. So a lot of this can be attributed to almost a 200% increase in battery electric vehicles in the city since the previous inventory. So this trend has been really great to see, but we also wanted to be cautious in assuming a trend like this will continue. We expect EV adoption to increase, but most likely not to the same extent we see between these 2 years, just because there's a lack of incentives at the federal level. And now looking at emissions over time. So this is 2003 to 2025, and this is all emission sources. So we've seen a 39% decrease in emissions. So the city is making really great progress towards that overall goal of a 50% reduction by 2030 from that 2003 baseline, but there's definitely still work to be done. And this chart shows all emissions, but if we do just look at comparable emissions over time, we are looking at about a 43% reduction. And those are just comparable sources. And now I will hand it back to Rachel to talk about science-based targets.
Thanks, Emma. All right. So back when we were working on the 2022 greenhouse gas inventory, a separate part of the project that we worked on was calculating a science-based target for the city of Dubuque. A science-based target means that the emissions that would be emitted in the city of Dubuque would be in line with the global Paris Accord goal of limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. And therefore, it's calculated to help a community understand what their part is in global climate change, as well as keeping in line with that limit of 1.5 degrees Celsius. So there's several different protocols out there. The one that is most commonly used is this one on the screen called the One Planet City Challenge, and that's from the World Wildlife Foundation and the World Resources Institute, WRI. And that there's several pieces of data that are included in that methodology that we pulled from in order to estimate that science-based target back for the 2022 inventory. Those being the US Human Development Index score. So we pulled that for the US. We have population projections for Dubuque. We have the baseline year of 2018, scope 1 and 2 emissions. So if you remember back to the beginning, scope 1 and 2 are going to be anything occurring fully within the boundary, and the emissions also fully occurring within the boundaries. So that's building energy use, transportation, waste and wastewater, electricity use, all of that within the city. And the reason the baseline year is 2018, the protocol requires us to pick something between, or pick an emissions baseline year between 2016 and 2019. It's believed by the science that that is when emissions peaked globally. And so everything can be estimated off of that. So Dubuque had a 2018 inventory, and we were able to use that as our baseline year. And we grabbed the community's population from 2018 to help us estimate that baseline data. And then from that, we project out, there's 2 sets of targets associated with a science-based target. The first being a 2030 target, and the second being a 2050 target. So every community has the same 2050 target. That one is net zero emissions by 2050. That helps us really keep on track fully for that 1.5 degrees Celsius limit of warming. And then communities have their own unique 2030 target based on what their baseline emissions are and their size and their population. So using the data and the protocol from the One Planet City Challenge. The estimated science-based target for Dubuque is a 62.4% decrease in emissions from 2018 totals by 2030. That, we understand, is a very ambitious target to be setting, especially given the changes at the federal level, which saw incentives for a while, took away incentives, regulations changing all the time, making it a little bit challenging to meet targets like that. But the goal and why we want a science-based target, we know emissions are happening and we know climate change is happening, and we're starting to feel things on the local level all around the country, all around the world. And we know that the only way really to mitigate the worst impacts of climate change are to do something, actions, anything. And we know we have to limit the emissions that are going forward. And so while we know it might not be something that is fully achievable, we like to set ambitious targets, knowing that we're trying to do our part and we're trying to do our city's own, account for our city's emissions going forward, and setting a target that will be ambitious, but won't be so overly ambitious that it seems impossible and doesn't allow for any action to continue or for any action to occur at all. So we know it's to do our part going forward. So we can measure how far we are or how close we're getting to that science-based target. So if we want to go to the next slide. All right, so 2018 is our start date or our baseline year for this science-based target. The scope 1 and 2 emissions total you can see on the screen. That's 819,408 metric tons of CO2 equivalents. You can see in the table what the estimated emissions for that year are in that top row. So in order to meet that target in 2030, Dubuque's emissions in 2030 would need to be around 308,000 metric tons, and then 0 by 2050. Though the reality emissions are the first 3 years. So in 2022, we had 734,531 metric tons of scope 1 and 2 emissions. And then now here in 2025, we had just shy of 668,000 metric tons. So from 2018, we have already seen a 20% decrease in emissions, and that's excellent. That's a lot of decrease over a 7-year period. So that's great. It does seem like there's a long ways to go to hit that 2030 target, but that doesn't mean that we can't keep striving to hit that target and try to put in the work to get us to where we want to be. And if you go to the next slide, we've broken this target down by the different sectors. So before we showed you the pie charts with the various sectors, stationary energy is going to be any kind of building energy use, electricity, natural gas, things like that. Transportation, waste and wastewater, and then industrial processes and product use, or the leakage of refrigerants from HVAC systems and buildings. We can see here what the real percent reduction has been so far from these sectors in 2022 and 2025. And then from 2030 on, that's the estimated target that we would want to see for emissions reductions in 2030 and beyond. So we can see so far in 2025, we've seen a 26% reduction in stationary energy use emissions from 2018. We've seen a 21% increase in transportation emissions from 2018. So that trend is in the opposite direction of where we're wanting to go. And then waste and wastewater, you can see we've seen a 68% reduction so far. And that is primarily due to those systems at both the landfill and the wastewater treatment plant in capturing and flaring methane gas. So we are pretty much on track with the waste and wastewater. We just want to continue to push for diversion of organic and recyclable materials going forward. This last one too, I want to note, so we didn't have an estimate of industrial processes and product use emissions in 2018. So we don't have a direct comparison to 2018. But what I can say is between 2022 and 2025, we have seen an 8% decrease in those emissions over that time frame. So that trend is starting to head in the right direction. And as you can see, in 2050, we're hoping for zero emissions in all sectors. If we go to the next slide, just want to frame this in the frame of business as usual emissions. So another thing we did in the 2022 inventory, we updated what we call our business as usual emissions model. So if we just stood there and did nothing all the way to 2050, what would emissions look like without us actually making any action at all? So without doing any additional actions, you can see that emissions in 2050 are down to 457,648 metric tons. That represents overall from 2022 a 38% decrease in emissions just by doing not a whole lot of anything and letting trends continue the way they have been. So that being any local adoption of electric vehicles, any energy efficiency that's already sort of happening in the background. And the main trend that's being baked in here is Alliant Energy's goal of 100% renewable electricity by 2050. So that's what's being baked in. And I just want to highlight the yellow star on the screen is real 2025 emissions. So we're actually below the total emissions that we would have expected in business as usual projections in 2025. And that's good. That means we are making additional progress, whether actions are being taken or if that's from the electric vehicles being adopted, the solar energy systems in the community, things like that. So we're above business as usual projections, and that's a great thing. And I will pass it back to Emma to take us home.
Thanks, Rachel. So now just looking at what Dubuque is currently doing in terms of sustainability and highlighting some projects going on. The Energy Savers Program. So this program provides high efficiency furnaces or water heaters to low-income residents who have had appliances for more than 10 years or ones that are in disrepair. The Youth Climate Action Fund, and this fund has given around $85,000 out in 19 microgrants to local youth and youth-serving community-based organizations. The Direct Pay Provision Program, so the city received $427,000 for the airport solar array and EV chargers. Branching Out Dubuque, this is an initiative that Parks and Rec is leading with a goal of planting 5,280 trees around the city. And the city has been utilizing Energy Star Portfolio Manager to manage utility usage and trends for municipal buildings. Now looking at what's ahead for Dubuque. So currently there are 2 municipal solar energy projects in the pipeline, and both of those are in that feasibility study phase. Updating the climate action plan, so the 50% reduction goal by 2030 can reach a wider audience, and then doing another round of the Energy Savers Program. And looking long term for Dubuque, we just wanted to put out some recommendations. So those would include investing in climate-friendly infrastructure and public transit, considering climate adaptation efforts like green stormwater infrastructure and land conservation, making sure to focus on incremental efforts. So this can be done through policy, and really even the smallest program or effort can make an impact over time. We recommend continuing to do outreach and education in the community, identifying sustainable funding sources to keep all of this good work going. And then lastly, we recommend that the city considers fully adopting a science-based target. Ultimately, all of this put together will lead to long-term climate benefits for the community, and that includes balancing that social cost of carbon, natural disaster mitigation, cost savings, and overall community resilience. And with that, we will open the floor to questions.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Rachel and Emma, and of course, Gina and Michelle. So I'll kick us off and then see what else we have. But all right, so we have a sense of what the science-based target is. It is clearly ambitious compared to where we are. I guess, the biggest question in my mind is one that we just kind of keep asking. I mean, we had a really good opportunity with some legislation that came from the federal level in a few years ago. But that legislation is no longer on the books, so we don't have what was known as the Inflation Reduction Act to kind of help with things like credits to individual users or business users or any sort of entity to be able to have federal dollars to be able to help with this. We also live in a state that isn't actively pursuing this currently from a legislative standpoint. So it kind of falls on us then to really do anything as a community to really push for some sort of a reduction. So I just want to realistically ask the question. I mean, what really is left for us to be able to work on? I mean, if we're all on our own and we don't have the assistance of a state government or a federal government to really take big swipes at this, where are we? I mean, what are some things, some ideas that you might have for us of ways in which we could continue to focus that could continue to bring that closer to the target that we want to now see?
Thank you for that question.
I think that is a great question and one that you are not alone in asking. I think a lot of communities have that same question. To start, I think I would try to take a stock of what you have the ability to do and what you have the ability to control, which is maybe starting with your municipal operations and saying, okay, let's take a look at our buildings. Let's take a look at our fleet vehicles, what we own and operate, and how can we, A, lead by example for the community, and B, make our operations as efficient and as clean and as sustainable as possible, and start there. Then I'd also want to look at, are there policies I could implement or ordinances that might make an impact? So things like building energy codes, trying to continually adopt the most updated and most efficient building energy codes if you're able. Also, I think that outreach and engagement part is really critical, and just getting people on the same page and trying to get that enthusiasm in the community, because a lot of this you can't actually implement yourself, right? You can't force a homeowner to put solar on their home. You can't force someone to recycle. But providing the outreach and education and building that community sense of excitement and willingness to pitch in can help to, build that support for when those, maybe that next IRA does come around, and then we've got those incentives at the federal level again, and then people are ready to jump on and try to get those incentives and implement them locally.
Thanks, Rachel. Gina, I know you want to say something too.
I would just add, I would echo what Rachel said. I think that we have a lot of opportunity with our existing infrastructure and our fleet. We have staff that are working on this and talking about it, and what does maintaining this look like? What do improvements that are smart and affordable, but also going to save us energy and money in the long run? And so we're thinking about it, but yes, it isn't going to be a windfall of funding. And this is part of what we're doing. We're working on an internal update of the climate action plan because we want to make it shorter term and very actionable, not just for city operations, but it is a community-wide inventory. And so we want to look at how can we help inspire or, offer a carrot to folks that do want to take action.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, Ms. Russell.
Thank you. Gina, you could probably answer this, or one of the people on the phone. I was wondering, the chart that you showed, how we compare to the other communities that were listed there. I wondered how we compare in our action plans. Do they have similar kinds of aggressive work plans like we have? Or, do they have a community action plan like we have? Do you know?
I don't know. Rachel, I don't know if you have looked into it when you were doing the comparison.
Yes, I do have an answer. So I believe if we are looking at all the communities, every single one of those has a climate action plan. I believe Lakeville's is still, it's either really new or still in development. But but all of them have climate action plans. Their targets, I would say, vary. I know for a fact Dubuque, or both Dubuque, not Dubuque, Bozeman, that's the one I'm looking at. Bozeman has a science-based target. Theirs is pretty close. I think it's a 64% decrease from their 2018 inventory by 2030. The others, I believe, are not science-based targets, but I could dig a little deeper into each of their specifics.
Well, I thought the chart was interesting, but it would be interesting if they also had, if you also had, how are they doing? You know, we are down X percent. How much are they down in the last 3 years? I'd be curious to see some of those kind of comparisons in the next round. Thanks.
Yeah, Mr. Resnick.
Thank you very much. So our goal is 50% by 2030. And when we first adopted that goal, it was a lofty goal. And I think the way to get the community excitement is to accomplish a goal instead of just moving the targets. Now, I appreciate that there are more needs, and there's a great need for this kind of work in the world, and we'll do it locally as well. But I think we want to achieve our goal of 50% by 2030. We got 43% in 2026. That would just to me, we want to build the excitement to accomplishment, and then we'll get to the next goal. So a couple things. It's very interesting. We absolutely have to do our best to do what we can. Yeah, it's interesting when I watch the news and those war combatants are blowing up huge oil reserves and these big billowing clouds are going into the sky. I'm saying, I hope Dubuque, hopefully Dubuque's part can mitigate some of this. But I mean, we have this enormous amount of pollution going up right now. The other thing that I'm glad that we want to plan and do the right thing that's smart about how to get it done. And I feel, I've told Gina Bell several times, that the more money you use, the more energy you use, because it took energy to make that money. So there will be diminishing returns if we just go too much. We have to make it systematic, and we have to have it planned. To me, we plan to be 50% by 2030. We're not there yet, but I think we can get people excited and get over the edge. But I mean, Dubuque, we are happy to have Gina Bell here, and our residents have made that accommodation, and she's doing great work. Michelle Kim is a wonderful gift for us for as long as she can be here. But those are my thoughts. And I would appreciate your thoughts about the connection between achieving the goal 50% by 2030, between that and community excitement in achieving that goal.
Gina first, maybe?
Sure. I can't stand up here and honestly answer because I don't know. We haven't talked to folks about, is achieving the goal that we set forth in 2006 more important than having a science-based target? So I don't want to speak to what the community is, but we will build in engagement as we update this and put together a proposal that shows what the community wants. I mean, I think we can potentially keep the goal and meet it and set a longer-term goal that is more ambitious and science-based. That's also a possibility. So as we explore that, we will be in communication with you all and proposing it to you so that you get to make the final decision. But certainly the community's input will be involved in that.
All right. Ms. Wethel, you can jump in anytime if you have anything you'd like to say.
Sure. Thank you, Mayor. I just had a couple of thoughts. I know as a council, we have discussed building inventories, and I think of those, I guess, and please, share your opinion on this as well, if you all would. The idea of, even though right now doing a building inventory, we may not have the funding
to take action upon that knowledge, we would almost be creating, if you will, shovel-ready like projects so that should state or federal funding become available, we are ready to apply out of the gate for that funding. I'm just curious as to whether other cities are doing, say, actively doing building inventories. Certainly, we have a historical city that has some more historical buildings that we feel we could improve there. When you look at other cities, both of the consultants from Lotus, if you could comment on that.
Yeah, happy to. We work with cities across the country, varying in sizes from as small as 1,000 up to upwards of 1 million people. And I think every city is trying to figure out these days, what can we do with what we have, and knowing that the actual funding to do different projects can swing over time. And depending on which state you're in, we have clients at the moment in Kansas, in Alabama, in other places where there is minimal state support. Those communities are still trying to get the work done. And they also, I think almost all communities these days are strapped by reducing funding to be able to do the work. And I think there is a lot of work in the background happening to set them up for future funding opportunities, because we can't assume there will eventually be funding, but we can work and hope that it does come back around at some point, or that some maybe foundational funding becomes available someday. So there are communities across the country that are working on building inventories that are really focused on finding those inefficiencies or those projects that really would be important to implement going forward. A lot of that work is happening, especially around the Denver metro area where I'm based. Communities are starting to do those, at least municipal building stock, if not the full community building stock analyses, to know should we be trying to push for those updated building energy codes? Should we be trying to get people to switch from fossil fuel powered heating sources to heat pumps or other electric based heating sources? Whatever that looks like in their community. So communities are doing that. I think communities are doing whatever is most relevant within their communities. So there's some that are more pushing transit and transit oriented development, or just increasing the amount of transit or types of transit options in their community. Some are more interested in looking at their own municipal fleets and trying to swap out electric vehicles and just doing the work to inventory their own fleets instead. So it looks different based on what the community's priorities are, but there are ones across the country doing their own building stock analyses in the interim. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for this. A couple more thoughts just to share before we close it out. I do think that the answer of trying to work on what we can best control and what is within our reach is a really smart approach for right now. In a time like this where we don't have a whole lot of assistance to get things like this done, we have a few things going already, and they were on the slide here. But for one is the branching out initiative. I think of all things, this is probably this is the clearest and easiest path to doing something that could make a real difference, and it can make a serious impact in people's lives, and you can see it all over the community. And you can be a part of it. You can help to plant a tree. You can be at one of the schools that Ms. Roussel visits on a frequent basis to be able to plant some of these trees. You can do some of those things, and I think the more we continue on with that initiative, the better. So hopefully we can continue to have that type of enthusiasm about that. The other one is listening to our young people. The Youth Climate Action Fund is an incredible opportunity for us. The fact that we do have some foundation assistance through the Bloomberg Philanthropies and a partnership with them that has continued over several years, I think if we can have young people excited about this, then that helps to be able to pass that excitement along to maybe the other generations that are here. Because that really is, you never know what kind of ideas you're going to get. You never know what type of work the youth are going to come up with. And there's some pretty incredible ideas out there. So I'm excited to have another round of that and be able to see that too. And then we have to keep continuing to do the things we're doing. You know, I know that we had major infrastructure issues with the wastewater treatment plant due to the explosion that was there. But the fact that we were using that system to capture methane and then doing the same at the landfill, I would hope we continue to do that. I would hope that we can continue to see that because it clearly made a big difference. I mean, it was something that it was one of the things we could control. We took a shot at it and we started to do something with that. The other things are a little harder. You know, the building inventory for things like us, residential stuff is a little more difficult. And then just looking at our fleets and those types of things. You know, we have done some work with that. We've got electric buses on the way, you know, to be able to do these things. But I think we need to take little bites at that. But for right now, the focus on the things that are working, I think we keep that up and then really position ourselves, as was mentioned earlier, for when we get more assistance to be able to do these things, because things change, attitudes change. So hopefully we continue to work towards a place that we can keep beautiful and keep breathing well. So thank you very much for your work on this. We'll continue to talk about it, continue to share some of all these ideas, and do appreciate the work session today. All right. Well, there is no further business in this work session, so we will be adjourned for probably about 7 minutes here until 6:30.